Hello biology students, and welcome to the third video in the evolution unit. So in this video, we're going to be discussing two different topics. So first, we're going to finish talking about natural selection, and more specifically, we're going to talk about how natural selection can affect polygenic traits. And then once we talk about that, we're then going to switch topics and talk about speciation, which is how new species form. So first, let's talk about how natural selection affects polygenic traits. So, first of all, remember that a polygenic trait is a trait where many genes are influencing one phenotype. And because of this, for polygenic traits, you end up getting a spectrum of phenotypes. So an example of a polygenic trait in humans is height. So you might get, so maybe the number of individuals who have the trait, and here's my trait. So I might have a few really, really short people, and then as we get taller, we have more and more people who are that height until we have some peak in the middle, and then as you get even taller, there are few people with that trait. So we get this spectrum of phenotypes. There's lots of different heights. And it turns out natural selection can affect polygenic traits in three ways. They can affect it as stabilizing selection, directional selection, or what we call either disruptive or diversifying selection. So first, let's do stabilizing selection. So stabilizing selection is when the intermediate phenotype of the phenotype range is favored. So this is very common, especially in stable, unchanging environments. So basically, in this situation, the individuals who have an intermediate phenotype survive longer and have more offspring. So in the next generation, there are more individuals who have that version of the phenotype and fewer individuals who have the extreme. So in this graph here, this top graph is showing the population before stabilizing selection happens, and down here it's showing you after. So you can see here I have a bell-shaped curve, but because individuals in the middle live longer and have more offspring, in the next generation my curve is narrower. I have more individuals with the intermediate phenotype and fewer at the extremes. So this dotted line is showing you what the population was before, just so you could compare. So an example will be human birth weight. So the average baby weight born is between 6.5 and 9 pounds. And if babies are born at a lower weight, they are less likely to survive, so they are less likely to pass that gene on. If they are born at too high of a rate, there might be complications with birth. The mother would have a hard time giving birth to that large of a child, so they would be less likely to survive and pass their gene on. So instead, the middle peak, or the middle weight, is selected for, and those babies are the most likely to survive the birth process and live to have their own children and pass their trait on. So the second type of selection is what we call directional selection, and this is very common during times of environmental change. So it's common when all of a sudden the environment changes or a population goes to a new, different environment. And this favors individuals at one end of the phenotypic extremes. So maybe if I have some spectrum of phenotypes here, the individuals at one end are favored, so they survive longer, they have more offspring. So in the next generation, there are more of them, you can see, and fewer of the ones that were less favored. So an example might be pesticide or toxin resistance. So maybe I have a bunch of beetles who live in a field, and I start spraying this field with pesticides to kill the beetles. And the beetles show some spectrum of resistance. So there are some beetles who are not resistant. There are many who are kind of resistant, and there are a few who are very resistant. Well, the ones who are very resistant are going to survive the best, so they will live the longest, have the most offspring, and in the next generation, I will have a much higher proportion of resistant beetles. Then finally, the last type of selection is called either disruptive or diversifying selection. And this is a type of selection that favors individuals at both extremes of my spectrum, but it does not favor the intermediate phenotype. And this occurs usually in patchy habitats where you have kind of two different habitats or two different environments coexisting in one habitat. So here you could see, here's my curve before the selection. Both ends have a favorable trait. So in the next generation, I have lots of the two extremes, but fewer intermediates. So the example listed here is that if there's an environment where there are small soft seeds and hard seeds, birds with small beaks and birds with hard beaks, or large beaks would be able to get the soft food and hard food respectively. But birds that kind of had beaks in the middle, like this part right here, would not be good at eating either food type. So they would not survive, but the two extremes would, creating a diversifying or disruptive selection type. So kind of an example to see all of these. If this is my original population, and here I'm looking at shell color, stabilizing selection would select for snails that had a medium shell color. Directional selection might select for snails that have one extreme of a shell color, so I would shift over. And diversifying selection might be both light and dark colored snails survive well, but not ones in the middle. Okay, so that was our three types of selection. So now we're going to change topics entirely and talk about speciation. So speciation is basically the formation or the emergence of a new species. And remember, we define species as a group of individuals whose members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So those two parts are important. They have to be able to mate, and when they mate, they have to be able to produce fertile offspring to be considered a species. So I'm going to give you an example of why deciding if someone's a species can be tricky. So these right here are called happy face spiders. And if you look at them, they all look very, very different. So if you just look at them, you might think, hey, these spiders are not part of the same species. However, because in nature they mate and interbreed all the time and have fertile offspring, they are in fact considered to be different species. So you can't go off how individuals look alone to determine if they're part of the same species. So let's talk about how speciation happens. So I'm going to give you a really simplified model, and then we'll look at some of the more specifics. So I want you to imagine a situation where I have some fruit flies, and all these fruit flies are part of the same species. They're hanging out and they're laying eggs on a banana. And then all of a sudden, disaster strikes, and a hurricane washes the bananas to a different island. Now, I have some flies that are still on the original island, and I have some flies that are on a different island. And I want you to imagine hundreds of years passed, and the two species are affected by natural selection, they're affected by genetic drift, they're affected by mutations, and they're affected by the absence of gene flow, because there's no gene flow because the fruit flies can't get between the two islands. And both populations are going to be affected differently. So they're going to have different traits will be selected for via natural selection. They might have different mutations, and over time, the species become more and more different. And then eventually, maybe one day they meet again, but now, because they have adapted differently, they might have different behaviors, they might have different morphologies, they might have different food preferences or mating times, and now, because of these things, they no longer mate for one reason or another. Maybe they physically can't mate, maybe their behaviors prevent them from mating, maybe their mating time prevents them from mating, but for whatever reason, they're not mating anymore, and now they are considered to be two different species. So speciation generally occurs when there's reduced or a loss of gene flow between populations. Because when there's a loss of gene flow, it allows two populations to evolve differently. And if they're not exchanging genes while they're evolving differently, eventually they're going to develop enough differences where they're not going to be able to mate anymore. And we call these differences that prevent mating, we call them reproductive barriers. Okay, so reproductive barriers generally it's a byproduct of changes in populations. So as populations evolve to different environments or adapt to different environments, they're going to evolve new traits that may or may not prevent them from mating with their original population ancestors. Okay, so there are two main types of reproductive barriers. There are what we call prezygotic barriers and postzygotic barriers. So basically, prezygotic barriers are barriers that prevent a zygote from forming. And if you've forgotten what a zygote is, remember a zygote is the cell, the diploid cell that forms when an egg and a sperm combine. So it's kind of like the first cell of a developing offspring. So prezygotic barriers are things that prevent zygotes from forming. And postzygotic barriers are barriers that allow a zygote to form, but then that zygote either doesn't develop, or if it develops, it's not able to have its own offspring. Okay, so some examples of prezygotic barriers. So things that prevent a zygote from forming might be temporal isolation. So maybe the two populations now mate at different times of the year. Temporal means time. It could be habitat isolation. So maybe they physically live in different places and they're never going to come in contact with one another in nature, so they're never going to mate. That would make them different species. Behavioral isolation would be maybe now they have different behaviors that prevents them from mating. Maybe it's two different bird populations that now have different mating dances. So because they have different mating dances, they're not going to want to mate with one another, and therefore they're considered to be different species. Mechanical isolation would be that their anatomy physically does not fit together, so they are physically unable to copulate and mate. And gametic isolation means the egg and sperm of the two different populations are unable to combine. So maybe there's a protein on the surface of the sperm cell that doesn't allow it to combine with the egg, for example. So those are some examples of prezygotic barriers. Some postzygotic barriers might be things like reduced hybrid viability, which basically means that this zygote can develop into an offspring, but then that offspring is really weak and sick and does not survive long enough to have its own offspring. It could be reduced hybrid fertility, which again means this zygote develops into an offspring, but then that offspring can't have its own offspring. And one of the definitions of a species is you have to be able to produce fertile offspring. So in other words, offspring that can have its own offspring. And then hybrid breakdown would be this zygote develops into an offspring, and that offspring can have offspring, but the offspring's offspring are infertile. Okay, so here's another slide just kind of describing what I just described. So you can see here are some definitions. So if you were confused by my explanation, I would pause here and read these and see if that helps you make more sense of it. Okay, so now we kind of know some causes of speciation. So one of the causes we kind of just alluded to is when populations of the same species are geographically separated, their gene pools are separated. But the question is, does that always cause speciation? So if I had a population of beetles hanging out in one area and a second population of beetles hanging out over here, they're never going to mate because they aren't close to one another. But would they actually be considered different species? And that's kind of a question that scientists wonder a lot, because we're kind of dealing with a dicey situation here, because if they do come in contact, they might mate. And really what scientists have decided on is it depends on the ability of organisms to move about. So with beetles, we would probably consider those to be two different species, because beetles don't move very far, they don't move very fast. So even if there were a river here, this beetle population is never going to get to this beetle population. However, if we were talking about birds, we might still consider them the same species, because birds would be able to fly across the river. So really, it depends whether or not geographic isolation can lead to speciation. Okay. So then finally, the last thing I want to talk about, again, it's a little bit of an unrelated topic, but it's the idea of this adaptive radiation. So I want you to imagine that I have a species. I'll draw a circle here to represent that. And then different small groups break off from this species and go habitat new areas. So now I have three little groups that have all habitated different environments. And, hundreds, thousands of years pass, and all these groups adapt to their new areas, and therefore now cannot mate with one another, and now are considered three different species. This concept of one ancestral species leading to many through speciation, we call adaptive radiation, because many species are adapting to different environments and they are radiating off the original group. And this happens often where we have lots of different habitats, so varying habitats, that lack a lot of competition. Basically, if we have a lot of unexploited areas that species can colonize and adapt to. And this can lead to new structures, it can lead to new species, and it happens a lot after mass extinctions. Okay, so to kind of summarize what I just said, adaptive radiation occurs when a few organisms colonize new unexploited meaning areas that are not being taken up by other species, so they have lots of resources. So, for example, the Galapagos Islands is an excellent example of this, because it was born from underwater volcanoes. So as these islands formed, all of a sudden there were these new land areas that not a lot of species had colonized. So plants and animals and microorganisms from nearby islands colonized them, and because each island was a little bit different, each species adapted a little bit differently. So now you have lots of different species coming from one common ancestor colonizing a bunch of new unexploited areas and becoming new species. That's adaptive radiation. So here's my example. So here's the Galapagos Islands forming from underwater volcanoes. Here I have some common ancestor, and individuals are moving to the new island and adapting to it. And then maybe a couple hundred years, some of those guys move over to the next island, and this environment's a little bit different, so they get different, natural selection affects them differently than individuals who stayed on the first island. And again, as time passes, they keep moving from island to island and adapting to these new areas until all the individuals that live on each of these islands are different species because they have adapted to different environments and can no longer mate. So this is why there are so many different species of finches in the Galapagos, because each one adapted differently to a different island. This is an example of adaptive radiation. They all had some common ancestor, but they radiated out and adapted to a different environment. Okay. And as I kind of alluded to before, this can also happen after a mass extinction. So if a lot of individuals die at the same time, all of a sudden there will be lots of unexploited areas that a species can colonize and adapt to and become a new species. So after all the dinosaurs went extinct, this is actually what led to the evolution of many mammals. Because the dinosaurs were dead, now there were plenty of new unexploited territory for the ancestor of the mammals spread to and adapted to that new area, creating many of the mammalian species we know today. So that's it for the video on natural selection types and speciation, and I'll see you in the next video.